dwarves? They hide in their mountains seeking riches.
It is in men that we must place our hope.
Hello, I'm Nicholas John.
And I am Nick Andrew. Today we come to you live from the Green Dragon. In this episode of our Prologue series, we continue our look at the peoples of Middle-earth. This time we're going to dive into the race of men and the race of dwarves. The race of men, Nick.
Yes.
The race of men.
Yes.
Manly men.
Yes.
Burly men.
Men in tights.
Men in tights.
Did any of them wear tights?
I don't know. It depends on what movie you're watching.
Oh.
Boromir wears some pretty bodacious tights in the animated movie.
Ooh.
It's kind of scary.
Tights. All right.
He's got like a He-Man hairdo going on.
Well, I suppose if you, depending on what era you interpret it to be in, you know, hose is appropriate attire, even for a warrior.
Okay. So, the race of men. Humans are everywhere. Humans. Some would say that men or humans are boring in a fantasy setting because, why humans when you can be elves and dwarves and wizards and bananas? I don't know. One thing I love about Tolkien is what he did with men. Cover your little kids' ears because the race of men is badass in Tolkien's work. They're so cool. They're so varied, which is hopefully what we're going to get into.
Going way back, we're not going to dive into the old history of the men, but to give you a sense of their history, to give you a sense of their history, go ahead and read the Silmarillion, and you'll learn all you really need or care to know, even though I'm sure there's more to learn. But the race of men are simultaneously the children of Iluvatar with the Elves. They are the second children. They come after the Elves, and in the setting of Middle-earth that we deal with, they come over the mountains from the east into the western part of the continent that we deal with the Shire on the west coast and Mordor kind of, shaping out where the east is. But they are an intended race of Iluvatar. They are gifted with the gift of mortality, which is a strange gift on first glance, but it is desirable to some of the elves. As we talked about with the elves, Elrond the half-elven chose immortality while his brother chose a mortal life.
Well, and even when we were talking about the elves last time, we talked about the fact that they were kind of bound to the fate of Middle-earth, which is where that immortality comes from. And when elves die, we're told very clearly, like, what happens to them. There isn't so much an afterlife for elves. There's kind of a limbo. They go to the, quote, halls of Mandos, end quote. And they just wait until the end. And what happens at the end, we don't know. And one of the great mysteries of the race of men is when they die, and they die of old age, which is completely alien concept to the elves, we have no clue what happens to them. But Iluvatar makes it very clear that this is a gift. Mortality is a beautiful gift. And, death is twisted and made to look dark. Like the great gift of Iluvatar to the race of men is twisted to be something that they fear. And again, like Nick mentioned before, if you read the Silmarillion, you'll get the full story there, and you'll get the full background and kind of what exactly I'm talking about. But I think it's worth mentioning, because mortality is twisted, which you see a little bit of a twisted reaction to death in Lord of the Rings narrative, with some of the prominent characters that belong to the race of men.
But we're getting ahead of we're dwelling too much on the death, I believe, but that is the main difference, one of the major differences between the elves and the men. There are different groups of men.
Yes, men. It's one of the races that's kind of pocked all over Middle-earth. You can't really go anywhere in Middle-earth and beyond without encountering the race of men. You can't really. And I want to clarify, I'm not saying human, because in Tolkien's work, they're referred to as the race of men. I don't think the word human is actually present in any of it at all. It's the race of men. Right. So I'm not being sexist. It's the race of men. You can't really go anywhere in Middle-earth from the northwestern corners and reaches, which we talked about being Breeland, and you can't go there. You can't go down to the southeast, south of Mordor, without encountering the race of men. They're everywhere. and each area is so different from the rest. They've got, I would say, probably the most varied culture in any of the races that we encounter.
Yeah, everywhere you go, the elves are kind of the same. The men are different, with different traditions, and I attribute that to their shorter lifespans. The generational turnover is one of the key factors in driving the differences in tradition. They have new kings, and they have new princes, and they have new towns, and they have new countries, and the history is compact because there are more people doing different things, and that creates major differences between groups like the Brelanders, or Gondor, or the Rohirrim, or the Haradrim, or the men of the East.
Khand. Yes.
You know, we have humans in the story, like Aragorn, who comes from the north, and we have Boromir, who comes from Gondor, from the White Tower. We have Barliman Butterbur from Bree, and we meet Theoden from Rohan, and they have very different outlooks on life. They have very different trajectories and traditions and things that they fight for, and it's all very interesting. They're much more varied, as you said, compared to most of the other races.
Right. You've got like the greed that you see in Lake Town, for those of you that have read The Hobbit or seen the Hobbit films. You've got Lake Town, you've got that mindset. You've got Rohan, which is almost Nordic in its outlook and it's some of its viewpoints. And I mean, to the point that they chant death before they ride onto a battlefield. Because I'm at that point, I pronounce you dead until we come out of this. And you've got Gondor, which reveres its former rulers. I don't really think there's another culture out there that builds statues monumentally high of its rulers. Not even the elves do that. And it just speaks to the differences in culture and, like you said, the differences in outlook on life and, I suppose, legacy and accomplishment. I mean, we talk legacy, and like we've mentioned, there are different kingdoms and different places, and they're pocked all over. The race of men and who we encounter in the Lord of the Rings narrative all, for the most part, branch off from a race of men known as the Númenóreans. We talked in the Elven podcast about Elrond and his brother Elros, who chose mortality. Elros was made the first king of Númenor, which was a race of men that was granted almost elf-like stature and elf-like grace and a much longer lifespan. And they were at some point, it describes even Sauron's perception of them, terrible to behold, great and terrible. And I mean, that's the race of Númenóreans. And that's a long story. And if you're interested in the details, there's the Silmarillion and the Book of Unfinished Tales that really expands on Númenor. But the men that we see in The Lord of the Rings, some of the most prominent characters, come from watered down Númenórean stock. And Númenor, when it sank, and I'm not going to talk about that, but it sank. Yes, it sank. Gondor, the southern kingdom of men, was one half, and Arnor was the other half. Arnor was northeast-ish of what we now know as the Shire. Weathertop, we visit Weathertop in the Fellowship of the Ring. Weathertop was an old and grand watch point for the kingdom of Arnor. Arnor was the second half. It was the United Kingdoms of Arnor and Gondor, both started by the same Númenórean, Elendil. And it's sad because Arnor's gone, totally gone. It's just a wreck of its former self. It's not even there anymore. Then we have Gondor. That's the other half of it. Do you have anything to add to that?
No, other than Gondor isn't really a shade of its former glory either. By the time we enter the story, and by the time especially that we get to where our heroes get back into Gondor, really the thing that they still have is the White Tower. They still have Minas Tirith, which holds its stature very well, but their capital city, Osgiliath, is taken over. It's fallen to the enemy. So they have the fortress that is Minas Tirith, but their capital city is already fallen. They are proud people, but their country is broken.
Well, and you have to consider the geography. And those of you that have seen the films have beautiful portrayal by Sean Bean as Boromir when he talks about the lands of your people are kept safe by the blood of my people. I mean, Gondor is the vanguard of the free peoples of Middle-earth. It's right there. It can see Mordor. It's beautifully depicted in the films. You're standing on the bow, as it were, that comes out of Minas Tirith, and you see right in front of you the mountains that surround Mordor, and you see the violent storm that Mount Doom is kind of producing. They're right there. I mean, if you talk about a people, a kingdom, a society, a culture that has had to endure, it's Gondor. And I even want to, like you talked about Osgiliath being their capital. There's the Anduin River, which comes down from the west and swoops eastward and goes between Gondor and Mordor. It swoops down and then goes south. And Osgiliath straddled this river, the great river Anduin. Osgiliath straddled it. It had access to the sea. And I'll go even further. There's a point in the narrative where we meet a location called Minas Morgul, where the Nazgul reside. And it's all creepy and beautifully depicted in the films. That used to be called Minas Ithil. It was the Tower of the Moon. And it housed a white tree. Those of you that have read the Silmarillion know what I'm talking about. It housed a white tree. Minas Tirith was called Minas Anor, the Tower of the Sun. They were twins, Minas Anor and Minas Ithil. And in the center was Osgiliath. And Gondor was beaten down. Minas Ithil was taken after one of its kings was... He rode forth to meet the Witch King and was never heard from again. Minas Ithil was taken, renamed Minas Morgul. Tower of Dark Sorcery, I think? And then we have Osgiliath that fell. And then Minas Anor is renamed Minas Tirith, which means the Tower of Watch. And if that doesn't speak to the kind of mode that people and society and culture has had to adopt, I don't know what does. Tower of the Sun becomes Tower of Watch.
It's interesting you talk about those two towers, because the name, the two towers for that book, is not clear which two towers we're talking about. It could be the two towers you spoke of, which is now Minas Tirith or Minas Morgul, or it could be Minas Tirith and Barad-dûr. It could be any of those kind of mixed up together.
It could be Cirith Ungol.
Yes, it could be Cirith Ungol. It could be Helm's Deep.
It could be Helm's Deep and Orthanc, because that's very prominent.
It's very unclear which two towers are meant to be the two towers.
There's one thing Tolkien never specified on. I don't know if it's even talked about in the letters.
No, but it's interesting to think about. And it could be there are two towers in combat all the time. Wherever you are, you're talking about two towers. That's just an interesting side note that I thought of while you were talking about that. We've spent all this time talking about these various things, but men are the race of men. They look like we are used to men looking. A little bit taller, I suppose, on average. They sort of match the elves, being around 6'4", 6 foot, something like that. Today, our average is somewhere in the 5'5", 5'11" range.
Yeah.
With a couple outliers like Elendil, who was said to be 7'11".
I will say Elendil was called the Tall. He was Elendil the Tall.
Nice.
So I hope that helps us there. But he's Númenorian. A lot of the men we interact with, like I mentioned before, are of Númenorian stock. Watered down, sure, but they are of Númenorian stock. There are men in Middle-earth that are not of Númenorian stock. They have no connection to Númenor whatsoever. And those are going to be the people that we see, like Barlow and Butterbur in the Prancing Pony, and the Haradrim that come and help Mordor from the south, and the Men of Khand and Rhûn, and Dunlendings. They don't necessarily have any Númenorian blood. I won't say they have no connection, I guess, because I don't know. Love is love. But I would say they have little to no Númenorian blood whatsoever. But the majority of the men we interact with in the narrative do, and their stature is 6'4" average. Aragorn 6'6". Boromir 6'4". Like you mentioned, Elendil 7'11". We need to rebuild those doors. Elendil's here.
Yeah.
Right?
Chop, chop.
Give me a carpenter, quick!
If you think about the cultures we have around the world, and you just go like country to country, and the differences that you have, just imagine that's how different the cultures in Middle Earth are. Music is different, language can be different. Most of what is spoken in Lord of the Rings is what is known as the Common Tongue, which is spoken by Gondor and the Númenóreans, and Rohan has their own language, even though they speak the common language, called Rohirric, which is, by all evidence, largely based on Old Anglo-Saxon languages.
We hear a little bit of it in the films, too, which is actually really cool. Eowyn's funeral dirge, as it were, is they use Old English for that. I mean, it's not perhaps exactly what Tolkien was envisioning, but I think it captures kind of the essence of what's implied.
The naming structure for the people, you could translate those out of Old English. Éowyn is split. If you parse it out individually, it's horse and joy. So it's either like joy of horses or joyful. I mean, put it together however you want. The intention is those two elements. That whole family are named with horse involved. Theoden, Éomer, Éowyn, Theodred. They all have that element, and I believe that's a strong element of the culture, because they are the horse people.
Well, and the culture, the architecture. Tolkien goes out of his way. We all know he's very descriptive when it comes to things like location, which is super important. Not many authors paint as clear or as specific a picture as far as physical locale. And Tolkien does a great job of very, 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 very specifically describing what we're supposed to be looking at in our mind's eye. And the horse motif is everywhere. You're talking about Anglo-Saxon or Old English influence in Rohan and the Rohirric culture, or the Rohirrim. The capital city, Edoras, has a golden hall, and the golden hall's name is Meduseld. Those of you that are familiar with the epic poem Beowulf, it's the same name, Meduseld. It's kind of cool. You can't tell me that wasn't done intentionally, and it's a way to kind of ground Rohan in something that we can recognize and something that we can identify with. And something that he was very fond of.
Yeah, absolutely. The Rohirrim, their culture trends toward this ancient Anglo-Saxon view. It's less clear about the other races. They seem to have much more of their own history, if you go back into Tolkien's writing, that they stand alone a little bit. But the Rohirrim really are... I think they were important to Tolkien because in the Great War, the First World War, his job was to break horses for war. That was one of the things he did. And so he would see a new horse however often it took, and he just broke them so that they could go into war. So I really feel that the Rohirrim were special to him somehow. And his description of the horses and the importance of the horses to the Rohirrim, he takes really special care to go into what that relationship is. Absolutely.
Well, and to speak kind of directly to what you were talking about with Tolkien's role during the Great War directly involving horses, the British cavalry was very important in the Great War. It played a pivotal role. And spoiler alert, Rohan, the de facto cavalry of Middle-earth, plays a pivotal role in the War of the Ring. And a little plug here, my favorite part of the entire book is that moment. Chills down the spine, tears in the eyes. It's beautiful. I love it so much. Anyway, moving along.
So let's move on down to the next race in our discussion today, and that is the Dwarves. Now, when we go to the Dwarves, we drop a solid 2 feet.
You're not wrong. They're natural sprinters.
That's how I've been told.
They're wasted on cross country. Very, very dangerous over short distances.
Now, here's something that I don't know if I knew or know, and that is dwarves seem to live a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Are they mortal or are they immortal?
All signs point to mortal.
Okay. They just have an extraordinarily long life.
They do. They do. Really, a couple hundred years probably for an average dwarf. I mean, Thorin Oakenshield, we look at the timeline of his life and the timeline of events in Middle-earth when he was alive, and it's like, holy crap. Now, to be fair, Thorin, as depicted in the books, looks much older. Thorin, as depicted in the films, Richard Armitage, is obviously not that old. So, I mean, if we were to base it on physical appearance, the actor who plays Balin, that appearance is probably more suiting to the physical description the Hobbit book gives to Thorin. But they went for something a little bit younger.
In the movies, he's the old one, right?
Right, he's the one with the beautiful Santa beard that curls.
Ah, the Santa beard. That's very nice.
I love him so much. He's so awesome. So cool. But yeah, they are definitely mortal. We know they're mortal. And I suppose it's not outright spoken to us, but there's enough evidence to support the fact that they're a mortal race. They're not immortal like elves are. They're not. And this all, I suppose, plays into their creation story.
Yeah, let's go over that really quickly, because we'll have to do that another time. But their creation story is kind of a mistake. I
was going to use the same word. They're kind of a mistake.
So they're created by one of the not Ainur.
No, one of the Valar.
One of the Valar, and they're created out of jealousy, out of just a pure creative desire. What's the story here?
Yeah, I wouldn't say jealousy. I'd say creative desire. Aule, the Valar that was responsible for the shaping of the mountains, and the craftmaster of craftmaster, that sounds terrible, but I'm going to go with it. The craftmaster of the Valar, he couldn't wait for the children of Iluvatar to come in. He was so excited because the Valar were tasked, and the Ainur that chose to come into and read the Silmarillion, trust me, you won't regret it. Power through it. Listen to me. Don't give up. I believe in you. They were tasked with preparing Arda, the world, for the arrival of the children of Iluvatar. And as we've talked, the elves are the first children of Iluvatar, and the men are the second children of Iluvatar. Well, Aule could not wait. He was so excited. He couldn't wait. Oh my god. So he made his own people, stocky and made from that which makes the mountains. He created the dwarves.
Yes, and once they had awoken and he taught them speech, it was recognized that they were there, and Iluvatar says, "What have you done? This is not how it's supposed to be."
I want to quick interject. This is one of, if not the only, moment that we know of where Iluvatar intervened in what was going on in the world itself, the created world.
Right.
One of the only... It may actually be, I need to reread it, I'm not sure 110%, but I will say right now, in this moment, it was the only moment that we know of that he directly intervened.
Right. So he says, "What have you done? This is not the way it's supposed to be. The firstborn are supposed to come first. The elves are supposed to come first." So he is going to destroy them.
Well, he being...
Iluvatar.
Aule.
Oh, he was going to destroy them
Aule.
out of shame?
He was so ashamed by the fact that he did it, that he raised his hammer and was going to strike them. That's and they right. flinched.
I remember the image. Yes.
Yes, they flinched.
And it was in that flinch that Iluvatar stops him, and he says... basically, you've made them, you don't destroy them. Iluvatar puts them to sleep until it is their time to come. So they effectively go back to the mountain. They sleep until after the coming of the children of Iluvatar.
Beautiful story.
It is. It's
just such... We've given the very abridged... I mean, in all honesty, if you were to go read it right now, there's not too much more detail than what we just gave.
It's better told, though.
Yes, you're not wrong. Tolkien is a little more eloquent than the two of us. But, I mean, that's their creation story. They're kind of an accident, and they feel so different, almost, than anything else that we find in Middle-earth because of that, I would think. And the fact that they're created from the stuff that makes the mountains kind of explains where they come from. And I want to just quick side note. We introduced them as the Dwarves. Dwarves was a pluralized word that did not exist before Tolkien. The plural of dwarf is and remains dwaro. Dwarves with a V. Dwarves, not dwaro. Dwarfs is not a word. Well, I guess unless something dwarfs something else. But to pluralize the people, or to pluralize a dwarf was dwaro, until Tolkien changed it to dwarves. Kind of like he did with the elves, just like we talked about with the elves. Elfin became elven, Elves became elves. Dwaro became dwarves to kind of differentiate.
Tolkien
And he does
use Dwaro.
Go
Was
ahead.
that what you were going to say?
I was.
Okay.
Dwaro.
There's the Dwaro Delph.
Yeah, the Dwaro Delph is just... Those of you that have seen the films, when Gandalf in the Mines of Moria, aka Khazad-dûm, can spare a little more light, he shines into the Great Chamber, and I believe it's the 21st Hall. Those of you that have played Lotro will shame me if I'm wrong here. I think it's the 21st Hall. I think it's the 21st Hall, with all the beautiful columns. That's the Dwaro Delph.
Yeah, in the movies, that's the hall from which they see the light that leads to Balin's tomb.
Yes. Yep. And it's the hall where we hear the infamous line, "What is this new devilry?"
That's the line you picked? Okay.
Sean Bean. But yes, Dwaro, the word Dwaro does appear in Tolkien's naming of a specific dwarven location.
But that's interesting. I did not know that was and remains to be the plural of dwarf. It's interesting because now with the rise of fantasy books, fantasy stories, dwarf and dwarven and dwarfs,
it's the norm.
That becomes the norm. So interesting.
Much like Tolkien flipped the paradigm with elves, like we talked about in the last prologue episode, he flipped the paradigm with dwarves. And those of you that have played Warhammer or Warcraft or World of Warcraft or anything else really out there, EverQuest, that's got dwarves in it, that depiction of that like, you could almost call it a stereotype. That stereotype of dwarves, of the mountain, and forgers, and smiths, that largely comes from the depiction Tolkien gives us. Which, I mean, talk about shaping a culture. Our nerd culture these days, by and large, comes from Tolkien.
Some people consider him the grandfather of fantasy.
I mean, he introduced things like orcs, goblins we know of today. That's another time. We're skipping ahead.
We'll get to that.
Stay tuned. Please look forward to it.
The dwarves, they're created, they're put to sleep. Eventually, they're woken up, and they are allowed to live as their own people. And there's two things I want to bring up. One is there's animosity between the elves and the dwarves. And we're not really sure what it is. We're not really sure who did it to the other one, or if it was sort of a tit-for-tat thing. But one possibility is that they showed up first, and the elves were supposed to show up first, and there's this deep injustice on both sides. One, that they weren't allowed to remain, and on the elven side, that they came first. So we don't know really the tit-for-tats on that one, but there's this really deep injustice to the supposed order of the world as it unfolds.
Well, and I'll come right out and say I don't know if I've ever heard that conflict responded to with what you just did. And that's kind of a whole new, like, mind blown. Because what I always took it for is what we know of Mim and what happened during the First Age with the sons of Feanor and the dwarf that they encountered. And then the culture we talked about in the Elven episode, the Elven culture that kind of straddled Khazad-dûm, and then the dwarves delving too deep. Like, I always chalked it up to that, and the narrative kind of, sort of, supports that. I mean, that you constantly hear elves refer to the dwarven greed. I've never looked at it the way you just said, and I kind of like it, because it makes it something that none of them have control over. It's just there. Because the elves are bound to Middle-earth. The dwarves are of Middle-earth, but not intended. They're actually physically of Middle-earth. Like, of the land. So, that's interesting. I like that.
Good.
That gives me a different way to look at things. I like that. Speaking of dwarves and Middle-earth.
Yes.
The portion of Middle-earth, let's go geography for a second.
Yes, that was my other point.
The portion of Middle-earth that they occupy, the portion that the narrative takes place in The Lord of the Rings, where the Blue Mountains are the west coast. The dwarves have occupied this area of land larger than the majority of men and elves that we also encounter. In the Lord of the Rings narrative, we go through what's referred to as the Mines of Moria. The mines of Moria were formerly referred to as Khazad-dûm, the great dwarven kingdom of Khazad-dûm, spanning from the western foothills of the Misty Mountains to the eastern foothills of the Misty Mountains. Those of you that have ever seen a mountain range in real life, that's some scale for you. This is a subterranean kingdom that spans from one side of a mountain range to the other. That's cray. This was around. This was here. I broke Nick. This was here. So far as we're led to believe, in the First Age. Like, when the narrative that we're focusing on is shifted so far west that, like, the Middle-earth that we know right now isn't even there, visibly, Khazad-dûm was already there. They had already delved it. They had already begun to build it.
That still blows my mind that it's that old. And the time at which the Balrog comes and basically ruins the kingdom. When is that? Do we know? Do we know when that happens?
The Ring, Anatar, Celebrimbor, Second Age?
Second Age.
I don't have a year.
Even
I'm sorry,
like,
kids. I don't have a year.
If from the First Age to the Second Age is several thousand years. Sometime in the Second Age, Khazad-dûm falls, and now we're several thousand years later, and the dwarves are still talking about it. Balin, who is one of the dwarves from The Hobbit, takes a company of dwarves, and they're going to reclaim it and rebuild Khazad-dûm. It's 30, I think, years by the time that Gandalf and company enter the mines that Balin has been there.
I need to correct. It was the year 1980 of the Third Age.
1980.
That the Balrog woke up.
Okay, so that changes things a little bit. The Third Age, 1980, we entered the story in about 3,000 something.
Yes.
So it's a solid 1,000 years of Moria being broken.
Oh yeah, more than that. It was resettled. Like Balin comes back in the tail end of like the 29th century of the Third Age.
Okay.
And recaptures it for like, I guess recolonizes it for 5 years?
Yeah,
4 years?
It's only about 5 years.
It's a brief period. They barely managed to recapture some of it.
Right. And they go there about 30 years before Lord of the Rings starts. So in the about halfway between Bilbo coming back to the Shire and then Bilbo leaving at his party, about halfway between there, Balin goes to reclaim Moria and rebuild Khazad-dûm, and it only lasts 5 years. It's overrun with orcs. It's got all kinds of issues.
Well, and to be accurate, it's overrun by goblins.
Goblins.
And I want to clarify, and people can hate all they want, goblins and orcs are the same race.
Mm-hmm.
Goblin refers to subterranean orcs. I'm just getting that out there.
Yep.
Those of you that want to hate on me, I'm sorry. I love you. I really do. But goblins and orcs are the same thing. Have a nice day.
We'll talk about that next time. When we enter the story, as it is, there's only one big colony of dwarves, right? And that's in the Lonely Mountain over in Dale? Or is that not accurate?
When in history? I'm sorry.
When we entered the story.
For the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
We have the Iron Hills.
Where are the Iron Hills?
It is northeast of the Misty Mountains. If you look at a map, we got a map of Middle-earth probably linked in every show note under the sun.
Yep.
We've got the Misty Mountains, which flow north to south, and then we've got the Iron Hills, which branch out from the Misty Mountains, kind of like from the northern point. It's kind of a T, and the eastern portion of that kind of west to east mountain range is the Iron Hills. So we've got the Iron Hills dwarves. That's where Gimli comes from. We've got the Lonely Mountain, which excruciatingly prominent during the Hobbit narrative. And then we've got the Blue Mountains in the west, which is where, prior to Thorin Oakenshield deciding to set out, the Blue Mountains, that's where his people are. They're in the Blue Mountains. So that we have dwarves prominently in Blue Mountains, the Iron Hills, the Lonely Mountain, and for a brief spell, re-garrisoned or re-colonized in Khazad-dûm / Moria.
Yeah. So compared to the men, the dwarves are very isolated into these very close-knit colonies. but that their desire is to retake and rebuild and become the power that they once were.
And I mean, before Smaug took the Lonely Mountain, they were prominent. And you've got to imagine a culture. I don't know if there's a culture built so much around, I almost want to use the word sorrow, for grandeur lost. Then, I mean, there are the trees, but you've got to look at Khazad-dûm, and we already talked about how long Khazad-dûm, sometime during the First Age, Khazad-dûm was built. And then we have nearly 2,000 years into the First Age. Is that right? 1,300 years into the Third Age, that they lose it. I mean, that is a long time. And then they lose it. And then the Lonely Mountain, they lose it.
You make an interesting point. The dwarves have the sadness for the lost grandeur. The elves have a sadness for the loss of their place. It's no longer the time of the elves. They have to move on. Men have their own sorrow in the way they perceive their short lives.
Right.
And the utter calamity that is war and the loss of life that ties into that. Hobbits don't seem to be affected by this. So when Frodo and Sam and the rest leave the Shire, they're leaving a place that is generally happy, generally upbeat, generally green and sunshine, and they enter a world of darkness, and they enter a world of sadness, and they experience all these different races in their various ways of coping with the evil of the world. And it's kind of an interesting little tour of Middle Earth and the sorrow that is involved in the wider world. And I never really thought about that. And as I'm speaking it, I'm wondering if there's a purpose in that, in the way it's written.
You really bring up an interesting point, because we see that through the eyes of Bilbo differently than we see it through the eyes of Frodo. Bilbo, we see the sorrow for a people that don't have a home. They just don't. And in Martin Freeman, great portrayal in the Hobbit films, and you'll say what you want to about the Hobbit films, but I think the acting is solid. He has that wonderful moment where he talks about the fact that he's got the comfort of his armchair at home and his hearth and his food. He knows where he belongs.
And you're right, I often think of Bag End. I miss my books. And my armchair, my garden. See, that's where I belong. That's home. And that's why I came back. 'Cause you don't have one. A home. It was taken from you. But I will help you take it back if I can.
And he's realizing that there are people out there that don't belong anywhere. And then we see Frodo, and Frodo gets to see the sorrow of the elves. He gets to see the sorrow of... Well, I mean, I suppose Frodo doesn't firsthand see the sorrow. We see that through the eyes of Merry and Pippin. We see the sorrow of the men of Gondor through Pippin's eyes. And we see the sorrow of the men of Rohan through Merry's eyes. And it's really... You're giving an old bean a lot to think about here.
One last question about the dwarves. Do we happen to know, is it written into the books where they were first created? I mean, does it even say, or is it just sort of... Because the time that we're talking about, this is still kind of in creation mode. You know, there's massive struggles between, you know, water and air and earth, and then Melkor comes along and messes everything up anyway with fire. And in the midst of this darkness where, you know, good and evil forces are actively shaping the world, enter the dwarves. The way the story is told, the geography is unnecessary. I'm just wondering if there's a place.
To my recollection, there's no geographical location that were given for the dwarves. They really, as far as the First Age narrative is concerned, they just kind of pop. Like, oh, there's a dwarf.
Yeah, okay.
They spring out of holes in the ground. So, yeah, we're not really... I mean, we're given the specific location for the elves, but we're not given a location for the dwarves. I might be wrong, but I'm like 99.9 repeating % chance certain.
Yeah, I don't recall one either. I just thought I'd ask the question. All right. We've given ourselves a lot to think about. I hope that you enjoyed this episode. Thank you for joining us for episode 4 of our prologue series of The Green Dragon Live.
There is so much more to come. Please go to our website, greendragonlive.com, where you can find out all about this show.
You can also subscribe to our newsletter where you'll get show notes and everything else.
Please don't forget to follow us on Twitter at Green Dragon Live, and shoot us your questions, comments, concerns using the hashtag GDLive.
Or visit our page on Facebook at facebook.com/greendragonlive.
I do want to also give a shout out to Harry Morell for our beautiful intro and outro music. You can find more of his work at youtube.com/Harry Morell. That's Morell with 2 R's and 2 L's.
Thanks again for listening. I'm Nicholas John.
And I'm Nick Andrew.
Join us next time when we are live from the Green Dragon.
Remember, the road goes ever on and on.
And if you don't keep your feet, there's no knowing where you might get swept off to. That was fun.
I liked that one. That was fun.
Very little notes to go off of.